If someone asked you right now what your blood pressure number was, you probably say something like 120/80 or 135/85. But here's a question almost nobody asks. Which of those two numbers actually matters more? Most people immediately think of the first number, the top number. That's the one doctors mention first, the one printed in bold on home monitors, the one that gets all the attention at checkups. But there's a good chance that focusing so heavily on that top number is causing you to overlook something quietly important happening with the bottom one. Stick with me because by the end of this video, you'll understand exactly what that bottom number is really telling you, why it's often ignored, and what you can do about it starting today. And a little later, we'll talk about a specific age range where this bottom number becomes even more important to watch. So if you're in your 60s, 70s, or 80s, you'll want to hear that part especially. Let's start with the basics. Explain the simple way. When your blood pressure is measured, you get two numbers. The top number is called systolic pressure. Think of it as the force your heart uses when it squeezes and pushes blood out into your body. It's like the moment you squeeze a garden hose nozzle to shoot water further. That's your heart working hard, pushing blood through your arteries. The bottom number is called diastolic pressure. This is the pressure in your arteries when your heart is resting between beats. Using that same garden hose idea, this is the pressure still sitting in the hose even when you're not actively squeezing it. It reflects how relaxed or how stiff your blood vessels are able to be in between heartbeats. For decades, medical attention leaned heavily toward the top number, especially in older adults. And there was a reason for that. As we age, the top number tends to rise because our arteries naturally become a little stiffer over time. So doctors, researchers, and health guidelines put a lot of focus there. But here's where things get interesting and where a lot of people, even well-informed ones, get caught off guard. Research over the years has shown that the bottom number carries its own separate warning signs, ones that can sometimes get overshadowed simply because the conversation about blood pressure became so top number focused. And this is exactly why this video exists. Not to say the top number doesn't matter, it absolutely does, but to make sure the bottom number gets the attention it deserves too. So let's talk about why that bottom number matters so much, especially as we get older. Imagine your arteries as flexible tubes, similar to a rubber garden hose. When you're younger, that hose is nice and flexible. It expands slightly when water rushes through, then relaxes back afterward. That relaxing phase is where your diastolic number comes from. A healthy diastolic reading generally means your arteries are relaxing well between heartbeats, allowing blood to keep flowing smoothly to your organs, including your heart itself. But when that bottom number is consistently too low, it can suggest your heart isn't getting enough blood flow during its own resting phase, which is actually when your heart muscle receives most of its own oxygen supply. On the other hand, when the bottom number is too high, it can be an early signal of increased stiffness or resistance in your blood vessels, something that tends to develop gradually and quietly, often without any noticeable symptoms at all. That word quietly is important because that's exactly the problem here. Blood pressure changes in general and diastolic changes specifically often don't come with obvious warning signs. There's no alarm bell, no dramatic symptom that makes you think, I need to get this checked. For many people, the first sign that something has been building for a while comes only after a routine check at the doctor's office, or in some cases, after a more serious event. This is exactly why understanding your numbers, both of them, matters so much more as we get older. Now, here's something that surprises a lot of people, and it's the point I mentioned earlier that we'd circle back to. As we move through our 60s, 70s, and 80s, there's a specific shift that can happen with these two numbers. The top number, systolic pressure, often continues to rise due to natural stiffening of the arteries. But the bottom number, diastolic pressure, can actually start to decline in some older adults. When this happens, it creates a wider gap between the two numbers, something health professionals sometimes refer to as widened pulse pressure. And this gap itself has become an area of growing interest because a wider difference between the top and bottom numbers can be a meaningful signal about how your heart and blood vessels are working together, not just how high or low either number is on its own. Think of it this way. If your top number is 150 and your bottom number is 60, that's a 90-point gap. Compare that to a top number of 130 and a bottom number of 80, only a 50-point gap. Even though the first example might look less alarming if you focus only on one number at a time, that wider gap is actually something worth understanding and discussing with a healthcare provider, especially if it develops gradually over time. This is exactly why fixating on a single number, especially the top one, can create a kind of blind spot. You could be doing everything right based on watching your systolic number improve, while missing an emerging pattern happening with the diastolic side. Let's bring this down to earth with an example. Picture someone named Richard, 68 years old, who's been checking his blood pressure at home for the past year. Every time he checks, he glances at the screen, sees the top number, and either feels relieved or a little concerned based on that single reading. Over time, his top number hovered in a range his doctor was comfortable with. But what Richard didn't notice, because he wasn't really looking, was that his bottom number had slowly dropped over several months. It wasn't until a routine visit that his doctor pointed out the widening gap between his two numbers and asked a few more questions about how he'd been feeling, particularly around dizziness when standing up quickly. Richard hadn't thought much of the occasional lightheadedness. He figured it was just part of getting older. But that conversation opened the door to a more complete picture of what was happening with his cardiovascular system, something that a single number alone wouldn't have revealed. Stories like Richard's aren't rare. They highlight exactly why understanding both numbers and the relationship between them gives you a much clearer picture than focusing on just one. Before we go further, there's something worth mentioning that many people overlook entirely, and it has nothing to do with your arteries at all. It has to do with how the reading is actually taken. A surprising number of blood pressure readings, both at home and even in doctors' offices, are affected by simple factors that have nothing to do with your underlying health. Things like sitting with your legs crossed, having a cup of coffee 20 minutes earlier, talking during the reading, or using a cuff that doesn't fit your arm properly can all shift both numbers, sometimes significantly. This matters here because if your bottom number seems to bounce around unpredictably before assuming something serious is happening, it's worth ruling out these simpler explanations first. Sit quietly for about 5 minutes before checking, keep your feet flat on the floor, rest your arm at heart level, and avoid talking during the measurement. Taking 2 or 3 readings a minute apart and looking at the average tends to give a much more reliable picture than relying on a single reading taken in a rush. This single habit alone resolves a surprising number of concerning readings that turn out to simply be measurement inconsistencies. So what actually causes the bottom number to shift as we age once measurement factors are ruled out? Let's break down the simple science behind it without getting overly technical. Your arteries contain a protein called elastin, which is part of what gives them their natural flexibility, allowing them to stretch and then bounce back with each heartbeat, similar to a rubber band. Over decades of daily use, quite literally tens of thousands of heartbeats every single day, that elastin gradually breaks down and gets replaced by a stiffer protein called collagen. This is a completely natural part of aging, similar to how skin loses some of its elasticity over time. As arteries become stiffer, they lose some of their ability to relax and expand the way they once did. This stiffening tends to raise the top number since the heart has to generate more force to push blood through less flexible vessels. At the same time, that same stiffening can reduce the cushioning effect arteries once had, which can contribute to the bottom number gradually dropping in some individuals. It's a bit like comparing a brand new garden hose to an older one that's been left in the sun for years. The new hose flexes and absorbs pressure changes smoothly. The older, sun-worn hose becomes stiffer, cracks slightly, and doesn't absorb pressure changes the same way. Your arteries go through a similar transformation over the decades, just on the inside where you can't see it happening. Now, before we go further, let's pause on something important. None of this means aging automatically leads to serious problems. Plenty of people maintain healthy blood vessel flexibility well into their 80s and beyond through consistent lifestyle habits, something we'll get into shortly. Understanding the why behind these changes isn't meant to alarm you. It's meant to help you recognize what to watch for and why paying attention to both numbers matters. Let's talk about the warning signs worth being aware of, remembering that these are general educational points, not a substitute for a proper evaluation from your healthcare provider. A consistently low diastolic number, generally considered below 60, especially when paired with a normal or high systolic number, is worth discussing with a doctor, particularly if you're also experiencing symptoms like dizziness, fatigue, or lightheadedness, especially when standing up. This combination could suggest reduced blood flow during your heart's resting phase. On the other end, a consistently elevated diastolic number, particularly in younger to middle-aged adults, can be an early signal of increasing arterial resistance, something worth monitoring closely with regular checkups. And that widening gap we talked about earlier, a large and increasing difference between your top and bottom numbers, is something cardiologists increasingly pay attention to, particularly in adults over 60, as a potential marker of arterial stiffness that goes beyond what either single number would suggest on its own. Here's a helpful reminder before moving into practical steps. Blood pressure naturally fluctuates throughout the day based on activity, stress, hydration, and even the time you last ate. A single unusual reading isn't necessarily cause for alarm. What matters more is the overall pattern over time, which is exactly why regular monitoring rather than occasional one-off checks gives you and your healthcare provider a much clearer picture. Now let's move into what you can actually do about this, because understanding the problem is only half the picture. The other half is practical action. First, consider tracking both numbers, not just glancing at the top one. If you use a home blood pressure monitor, get in the habit of writing down or recording both readings along with the date and time. Over a few weeks, you'll start to notice patterns. Whether your numbers tend to run higher in the morning, whether they change after certain activities, and whether that gap between top and bottom stays consistent or starts to widen. Second, movement matters more than most people realize when it comes to arterial flexibility. Regular walking, even at a moderate pace, has been associated with helping maintain healthier blood vessel function over time. You don't need intense exercise. Consistency matters far more than intensity here. A daily 20 to 30 minute walk most days of the week is a realistic and sustainable habit that supports overall cardiovascular health, including the flexibility of your arteries. Third, pay attention to sodium intake, but in a balanced, realistic way rather than an extreme one. High sodium intake has long been linked to blood pressure changes, largely because it affects how much fluid your body retains, which in turn affects the pressure inside your blood vessels. Instead of aiming for a completely sodium-free diet, which is neither realistic nor necessary for most people, focus on reducing processed and packaged foods, which tend to be the largest source of hidden sodium, far more than the salt shaker on your table. Fourth, prioritize potassium-rich foods as part of a balanced diet. Foods like leafy greens, bananas, sweet potatoes, and beans contain potassium, a mineral that works alongside sodium to help regulate fluid balance and support healthy blood vessel function. Think of sodium and potassium as two sides of a scale that work together rather than focusing on cutting one out entirely. Fifth, and this one surprises people, pay attention to your hydration levels, particularly if you've noticed lower diastolic readings along with dizziness. Mild dehydration can affect blood volume, which can influence both numbers, sometimes contributing to that bottom number dropping further than it otherwise would. Simple, consistent hydration throughout the day, rather than large amounts all at once, tends to support more stable readings. Sixth, manage stress in ways that work realistically for your daily life. Chronic stress triggers the release of hormones that can temporarily raise blood pressure and over time contribute to increased arterial resistance. This doesn't mean you need to eliminate stress entirely, which isn't realistic for anyone. Simple, sustainable practices like slow breathing exercises for a few minutes each day, spending time outdoors, or maintaining social connections have all been associated with better long-term cardiovascular patterns. Seventh, be aware of how temperature affects your readings, particularly if you live somewhere with hot summers or cold winters. Heat can cause blood vessels to widen, which sometimes lowers the bottom number, while cold temperatures can cause vessels to narrow, sometimes raising both numbers temporarily. This isn't something to worry about on its own, but it's useful context when you're tracking patterns over time, especially if you notice seasonal shifts in your readings. Eighth, if you take medications particularly for blood pressure, heart conditions, or even something as common as medication for enlarged prostate or allergies, it's worth understanding that some medications can influence diastolic pressure specifically, sometimes lowering it more than intended. This isn't a reason to stop or adjust anything on your own. It's simply a reason to mention your complete blood pressure pattern, both numbers, to whoever prescribes or manages your medications so they have the full picture when making decisions about your care. Ninth, prioritize quality sleep. During deep sleep, your blood pressure naturally dips, giving your heart and blood vessels a period of recovery. Poor or inconsistent sleep can interfere with this natural dip, which over time may contribute to less flexible blood vessels. Simple habits like keeping a consistent bedtime, limiting screen time before bed, and keeping your bedroom cool and dark can meaningfully support this natural nighttime recovery process. 10th, bring your complete history to your next doctor's visit, not just your most recent reading. If you've been tracking both numbers over several weeks or months, bring that record with you, whether it's a simple notebook, a printed log, or notes on your phone. Many people show up to appointments with only a vague memory of it's usually around 130-something, which gives your doctor far less to work with than an actual pattern over time. A written history showing both numbers along with the dates, times, and any symptoms you noticed gives your healthcare provider something concrete to evaluate rather than a single snapshot that may or may not reflect your typical pattern. This is particularly valuable if you've noticed that gap between your top and bottom numbers widening gradually over recent months. Bringing that pattern to your doctor's attention rather than waiting to be asked about it puts you in an active role in your own health care, which tends to lead to more thorough, personalized conversations about what those changes might mean for you specifically. Now, here's an important point I want to be very clear about. None of these habits are about achieving a perfect number or completely reversing decades of natural arterial changes. They're about supporting your cardiovascular system in a realistic, sustainable way and giving your body the best possible conditions to maintain healthy blood vessel function for as long as possible. And this leads to an important reminder. If you've noticed symptoms like dizziness, unusual fatigue, lightheadedness when standing, or if you've noticed a consistently low bottom number alongside a normal or elevated top number, this is genuinely worth a conversation with your doctor. They can look at your complete pattern over time, consider any other health factors specific to you, and help determine whether further evaluation is needed. This isn't about causing worry. It's about giving you complete information so you can have a more informed conversation at your next appointment. There's one more piece of this puzzle worth understanding because it connects the dots between your blood pressure numbers and the rest of your body in a way that isn't always obvious. Your kidneys, for example, rely heavily on steady, consistent blood flow to filter waste from your bloodstream throughout the day. When diastolic pressure drops too low over extended periods, kidney tissue can receive less consistent blood flow during the heart's resting phase, potentially placing extra strain on kidney function over time. This is part of why healthcare providers who monitor kidney health often pay close attention to both blood pressure numbers together rather than focusing on just one. Similarly, your brain depends on a steady supply of oxygen-rich blood, and unlike some other organs, it doesn't tolerate drops in blood flow particularly well. This is part of the reasoning behind why a widening gap between your top and bottom numbers, particularly in older adults, has become an area of active research interest when it comes to long-term brain health and cognitive function. This doesn't mean a low diastolic reading automatically causes problems elsewhere in the body. It simply illustrates why your cardiovascular system doesn't operate in isolation. Your heart, blood vessels, kidneys, and brain are all connected through this same network of pressure and flow, which is exactly why understanding both numbers gives you a much more complete picture of your overall health, not just your heart health in isolation. This connected view is also why many healthcare providers today take a broader approach to blood pressure management than simply chasing a single target number. Instead, they look at your complete pattern over time, your symptoms, your other health factors, and the relationship between your systolic and diastolic readings to build a more personalized picture of your cardiovascular health. This is worth keeping in mind if you ever feel like blood pressure management has felt overly simplified in the past, focused only on getting one number below a certain threshold. The fuller picture, the one we've walked through together in this video, tends to be far more useful in the long run. Let's take a moment to bring everything together. Blood pressure isn't just one number to glance at and move on. It's a relationship between two numbers, each telling a different part of the story about how your heart and blood vessels are working together. The top number reflects the force of each heartbeat. The bottom number reflects how well your blood vessels relax and maintain steady blood flow in between those beats. And the gap between the two can reveal patterns that neither number shows on its own. As we age, it's natural for arteries to undergo changes, generally involving increased stiffness in the top number and sometimes a gradual decline in the bottom number. Understanding this shift doesn't mean something is automatically wrong. It means you now have a clearer picture of what to watch for and the practical tools to support your cardiovascular health moving forward, whether that's through consistent movement, balanced nutrition, hydration, stress management, or quality sleep. The most valuable thing you can do starting today is simple. Start looking at both numbers, not just one. Track them over time rather than reacting to a single reading. And if you notice a pattern that concerns you, especially alongside symptoms like dizziness or fatigue, bring that complete picture to your healthcare provider rather than waiting for something to feel obviously wrong. Small, consistent habits applied over months and years tend to matter far more than any single dramatic change. And now that you understand what both of these numbers are really telling you, you're in a much stronger position to notice patterns early and make informed decisions about your own health. I'd love to hear from you in the comments. Which part of this surprised you the most? The widening gap between the two numbers, or the fact that the bottom number can actually decline as we get older? Let me know your age and where you're watching from, and if you've ever had a conversation with your doctor about your diastolic number specifically, share your experience. It might help someone else watching who's wondering the same thing. If this video gave you a clearer picture of your own numbers, consider sharing it with someone who could benefit from understanding both sides of their blood pressure reading, not just the one that usually gets all the attention.